My name is Mark Stevens, and I never believed in the supernatural until that fateful night in the swamp. It was a humid summer evening, and I was deep in the heart of the Louisiana Bayou. I had come to this remote place to research the unique ecosystem for my biology thesis. The swamp was alive with the sounds of nature, the chorus of frogs echoing through the dense foliage. I had always found their croaking somewhat soothing, a reminder of the vibrancy of life in these murky waters. As dusk fell, I set up camp near a small clearing by the water's edge. The air was thick with the smell of decaying vegetation and the constant buzz of insects. I pitched my tent, lit a small fire, and prepared to spend the night recording the nocturnal activities of the swamp's inhabitants. Little did I know that this night would be unlike any other. It started with a sudden silence. The usual cacophony of frogs and insects abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I glanced around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing unusual. Assuming it was just a natural lull, I continued my work. Then I heard it. A low, guttural croak that seemed to come from the depths of the swamp. It was unlike any frog sound I had ever heard, deeper and more resonant, almost like a growl. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured toward the source of the sound. The beam of light flickered as I pushed through the thick underbrush, my boots sinking into the soft, wet ground. The croaking grew louder, more insistent, drawing me deeper into the swamp. I stumbled upon a small clearing, and there, in the dim light of my flashlight, I saw them. Hundreds of frogs, their eyes glowing an unnatural red, were gathered around a large, gnarled tree. At the base of the tree was a small, murky pond, its surface rippling with movement. The frogs were utterly still, their crimson eyes fixed on the water. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the water began to bubble and churn. A massive, dark shape emerged from the depths, rising slowly. It was a frog, but unlike any frog I had ever seen. It was enormous, at least 3 feet long, its skin mottled and slick with algae. Its eyes were a fiery red, matching those of the smaller frogs, and its mouth opened in a wide, menacing grin. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The giant frog let out a deafening croak, and the smaller frogs responded in unison, their chorus reverberating through the night. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and I realized that I was witnessing something ancient and malevolent. As the giant frog advanced toward me, I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. My flashlight slipped from my grasp and went out, plunging me into darkness. I could feel the ground tremble as the creature approached, its heavy breath hot against my skin. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. The croaking followed me, relentless and echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my camp, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I grabbed my gear and fled, not daring to look back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in that swamp. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. The bayou is home to things far older and darker than we can understand. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the swamp, the giant frog and its crimson-eyed followers are still waiting, their ancient croak echoing through the night.
My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how I encountered the Ghost Raider. It started on a cold October night. I was driving back from a late shift at the local diner, the only source of light being the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the thick fog that rolled over the deserted highway. The radio crackled with static, occasionally sputtering out fragments of an old country song. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I blamed it on the cold. I had always been fascinated by ghost stories, but I never really believed in them. That was until I saw him. As I rounded a bend, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Dressed in a tattered old leather jacket, he stood motionless, his eyes glowing an eerie red in the darkness. At first, I thought he was just a hitchhiker, but something about him felt wrong. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. As I got closer, I noticed his face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his breath misted in the chilly air. His motorcycle, a vintage Harley, was parked beside him, looking as ancient and worn as he did. The bike's headlight flickered like a dying candle. "Need a lift?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sense of dread washed over me. It was then that I realized I was looking at something not of this world. He climbed onto his bike without a word and revved the engine. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 angry souls. Before I could react, he took off down the highway, his red eyes leaving a trail of light in the fog. I watched in stunned silence as he disappeared into the night. Shaken, I continued my drive home, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. When I finally reached my house, I locked the doors and windows, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light. But the nightmares started that very night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of the Ghost Raider's motorcycle echoing in my ears. I saw him in every dark corner, felt his presence lurking just out of sight. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fear. I drove back to the spot where I had first seen him. The fog was even thicker this time, the air colder. I parked my car and waited, my heart racing. Hours passed, and just when I was about to give up, I heard it, the unmistakable roar of his motorcycle. The Ghost Raider emerged from the fog, his red eyes burning with an unholy light. He stopped in front of me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves, he spoke. "You cannot escape me, Daniel Carter. Your soul is marked." With that, he vanished into the night, leaving me alone and trembling. I never saw him again after that, but I could feel his presence, always watching, always waiting. I moved away, changed my name, tried to start a new life. But no matter where I go, I know he'll find me. Because the Ghost Raider never forgets. And he never forgives.
My name is Emily Thompson, and this is the story of the most terrifying experience of my life. I had just moved to the city for my first job after college. I found a small, affordable apartment in an old building downtown. It was nothing fancy, but it was close to work and the rent was within my budget. The only downside was that I needed to share it with a roommate to afford it. I found a roommate through a listing online, a quiet guy named Jake. He seemed normal enough, polite, kept to himself, and paid his share of the rent on time. The first few weeks went smoothly. Jake was often out, leaving early and coming home late. When he was around, he mostly stayed in his room. We exchanged pleasantries and occasionally chatted about mundane things like the weather or the latest TV shows. It was an ideal arrangement, or so I thought. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, but it was too faint to make out any words. I brushed it off as Jake talking in his sleep, or maybe just the sounds of the old building settling. I pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep. The next night, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more distinct. It was definitely coming from Jake's room. I got up and walked over to his door, pressing my ear against it. The whispering continued, low and urgent, like a one-sided conversation. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it sent chills down my spine. The following day, I decided to ask Jake about it. When he came home, I casually brought it up. "Hey Jake, do you talk in your sleep? I heard some noises from your room last night." He looked at me with an odd expression and shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Maybe it was just the building. This place makes all kinds of weird noises at night." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right, but the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next few nights, the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I started to notice other strange things too. Objects in the apartment seemed to move on their own. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the coffee table. The TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, the volume blaring. One evening, I came home to find Jake sitting in the dark living room, staring at the blank TV screen. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and he didn't seem to notice me come in. "Jake?" I called softly. "Are you okay?" He slowly turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn. "They don't like you," he whispered. A cold wave of fear washed over me. "Who doesn't like me, Jake?" "Them," he said, pointing to the empty air beside him. "They don't want you here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Jake, you're scaring me. Who are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just got up and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. That night, the whispering was louder than ever. It felt like it was coming from all around me, surrounding me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah, asking if I could crash at her place for a few days. She agreed, sensing the urgency in my voice. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't tell Jake I was leaving. I just couldn't face him. At Sarah's place, I finally felt safe. I told her everything, and she suggested I find a new place to live. I agreed, knowing I couldn't go back to that apartment. A few days later, I went back to pack up the rest of my things. The apartment was eerily quiet. Jake's door was open, but he wasn't there. As I packed, I found a small, old notebook under the couch. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with Jake's handwriting, but the words made no sense. It was like he had been writing in some sort of code or another language. The last few pages were different, though. They were filled with frantic scribbles and repeated phrases like, "They are here," and "They don't like her." I felt a chill as I realized he had been writing about me. I quickly finished packing and left the apartment, leaving the notebook behind. I moved in with Sarah temporarily while I looked for a new place. A few weeks later, I heard from the landlord. He told me that Jake had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. He also mentioned that the previous tenant had left under strange circumstances, too. I never found out what really happened in that apartment or who they were. But I do know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of those eyes watching me in the dark and the whispers that still haunt my dreams.
My name is James Carter, and I'm about to tell you the most terrifying story of my life. It all began at a party where I met a woman who would haunt my dreams and waking life alike. It was a warm summer night, and my friend Dave was throwing one of his legendary parties. His house was packed with people, laughter, and the sound of music thumping through the walls. I was nursing a drink in the corner, trying to relax after a long week at work, when I saw her. She was standing alone by the fireplace, her presence almost magnetic. She was strikingly beautiful, with long, raven-black hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow under the dim light. Her red dress clung to her slender frame, and she held herself with an air of effortless grace. I felt a strange pull towards her, an inexplicable need to speak to her. I made my way through the crowd, feeling oddly nervous as I approached. "Hi, I'm James," I said, offering a smile. She turned those intense eyes on me and smiled back, but there was something unsettling about it. "Hello, James. I'm Lila." We chatted for a while, and despite the growing unease in my gut, I found myself captivated by her. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, her eyes never leaving mine. But there was an underlying coldness to her gaze, a predatory glint that sent shivers down my spine. As the night wore on, Lila suggested we step outside for some fresh air. I hesitated, but the strange allure she had over me was too strong to resist. We walked out into the garden, the party's noise fading into the background. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the trees, and the night was filled with the sound of chirping crickets. We found a secluded spot near an old oak tree, and Lila leaned against it, her eyes fixed on me. "You know, James," she said softly, "there's something about you that intrigues me." I tried to respond, but my throat felt dry. There was something about her voice, a hypnotic quality that made it hard to think clearly. She stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing my arm. "Do you believe in fate?" she whispered. Before I could answer, her expression changed. The predatory glint in her eyes intensified, and her smile twisted into something cruel. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like a prey cornered by a predator. "Lila, I should get back to the party," I stammered, my heart racing. She laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the garden. "Oh, James, you can't leave now. We're just getting started." In that moment, everything about her changed. Her eyes darkened to an unnatural black, and her beautiful features contorted into a grotesque mask of malevolence. Her fingers dug into my arm with an inhuman strength, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. I turned and ran, the sound of her laughter following me like a shadow. I didn't stop until I was back inside the house, the warmth and noise of the party a stark contrast to the horror outside. I didn't see Lila again that night, but her presence lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes watching me, even in the crowded room. I left the party early, my heart still pounding with fear. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of her in mirrors and reflections, her cold black eyes watching me with that twisted smile. My nights were plagued with nightmares of her chasing me, her laughter echoing in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was too real. I started avoiding mirrors and reflective surfaces, but it was no use. She was always there, lurking just out of sight, a constant reminder of that night. One evening, I was home alone, trying to focus on a book to distract myself. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a chill filled the room. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were black voids, her smile a rictus of pure evil. "You can't escape me, James," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. She stepped closer, her form shifting and flickering like a shadow. "Your fear," she hissed. "It feeds me." I ran to the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. I was trapped, my mind racing with terror. She moved closer, her presence suffocating, and I felt my strength ebbing away. In a desperate bid to save myself, I grabbed a mirror from the wall and held it up to her. For a moment, she recoiled, her form flickering and distorting. The sight of her own reflection seemed to weaken her, and I seized the opportunity. I shouted words of defiance, willing her to leave me alone. With a final piercing scream, she vanished, leaving me alone in the now eerily silent house. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Since that night, I haven't seen Lila again. But the memory of her still haunts me, a reminder of the terror that lurks just beyond the veil of our reality. I can only hope that whatever she was, she's gone for good. But deep down, I know that the fear she instilled in me will never truly fade.
My name is Lisa Warren, and I've always had vivid dreams. Sometimes, they're wonderful, fantastical escapes from reality. Other times, they're dark, unsettling experiences that linger long after I wake. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that became all too real. It started on a night like any other. I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. I fell asleep almost instantly, slipping into a dream that felt unusually lucid. In the dream, I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes you acutely aware of every little sound. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw someone standing by the window, their back to me. It was a woman with long, dark hair, wearing a white nightgown. She was staring out into the darkness beyond the window. "Mom," I called out, my voice trembling. The woman turned slowly, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't my mother. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. A chilling smile spread across her lips, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick molasses. The woman's laughter echoed through the house, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled and fell, and as I looked up, she was standing over me, reaching out with long, bony fingers. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It had to be my imagination. Dreams can do that, blur the line between reality and illusion. I took a deep breath and forced myself to get out of bed. I had to prove to myself that it was just a dream. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark and quiet, just like in my dream. I walked slowly, my footsteps eerily echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw her, standing by the window, just as she had been in my dream. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. I blinked, hoping she would disappear, but she remained, her dark eyes fixed on me, that chilling smile stretching across her face. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she began to move toward me, her feet not seeming to touch the ground. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but again, my legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through thick molasses. Her laughter filled the house, louder and more menacing. I reached the front door and yanked it open, fleeing into the night. I ran down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a well-lit gas station. I turned back, expecting to see her following me, but the street was empty. For the next few nights, I stayed at a friend's house, too terrified to return home. I told her about the dream, about the woman, but she just laughed it off, saying I'd been watching too many horror movies. I wanted to believe her, to think that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Eventually, I had to go back home. I couldn't avoid it forever. I returned during the day, hoping the sunlight would chase away the shadows that haunted my nights. For a while, things seemed normal. The house was just a house, empty and ordinary. But then, the dreams started again. Every night, I found myself back in that hallway, the woman's black eyes staring at me, her laughter echoing through the house. And every night, I woke up to the sound of her laughter, growing closer and closer. I couldn't escape her, not in my dreams, not in reality. She was always there, watching, waiting. I started to see her out of the corner of my eye, in mirrors, in reflections. She was always just a step behind me, no matter where I went. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The line between dream and reality has blurred beyond recognition. I fear that one day, I won't wake up at all. I'll be trapped in that dream, with her, forever.